If you had a favorite team and they just hired a new coach starting in 2022, what would you prefer? So we're Pate State University, we got a new hire. Do we want an offensive-minded coach or do we want a defensive-minded coach? And to be honest with you, Jordan, I don't have a strong feel on this. Guess I'm in the minority. I don't really care that much about which side of the ball you specialize on. Seems like everyone else has got a strong take on this. Here's my take. I want you to play a certain style of football. I don't want to hire a pinball coach. I don't want to hire a guy whose modus operandi is that his teams have had to score 45 to have a chance to win. So I don't want that. I also don't want a guy who, bristles at the notion of the forward pass. I don't want that. But you could be an offensive guy or a defensive guy. Like Nick Saban's a defensive guy. His offenses have rewritten the college football record books recently. So what does that really mean? Could you tell watching Alabama games that Saban was a defensive guy? No. So I don't really care about that. Here's why I mentioned Saban. And this is how I would hire if I were at Pate State. Yeah, I'd go get Nick Saban if he were available. But what I want is I want a guy who understands the bigger picture. So when I interview a head coach, sure, I want to know what your overall philosophy is. I want to know, if you're a defensive guy, how would you hire offensively? That's one of the first things I want to know, actually. How do you hire on the opposite side of the ball from the side you specialize on? How much do you believe in delegating responsibility? How much are you involved in the opposite side of the ball's day-to-day preparation and in-game implementation? Yeah, I want to know all that. But you want to know what else I want to know? And this is really paramount in today's game more so than it ever has been. Do you have at least a working knowledge of marketing? Do you have at least a working knowledge of public relations? Do you have, at the very least, I'm not asking you to be an expert, but do you have a working knowledge of economics? Do you have a working knowledge of how the entire NIL game is played? What are your people skills? How much is my donor class going to be able to interact with you reasonably? That stuff matters because you're no longer just making your living on a grease board and in the living rooms of 17-year-old kids. You're now the face of my organization, and I would hire you and I would vet you while I was hiring you the same way I would if I were putting you in my, CEO's chair, because that's what you are now. And I think for a long time, maybe in some cases up until today, a lot of programs still view their head coach as just a football coach. That's not what you are anymore. Whenever I have head coaches on the show, I asked Mario Cristobal a couple of weeks ago, explain to people, I guess I urged him to explain to people how different the role is from what people perceive it to be. And he said, only a fraction of my time is spent on football, actual on-field football-related matters. A whole huge chunk of my average day is spent on all kinds of administrative things of this nature and that nature. I want a guy who gets the big picture. I want a guy who knows people. I want a guy who has leadership qualities, and I want a guy who can display that when I'm interviewing him. So if that's a defensive guy, if that's an offensive guy, I don't really care. I'm 51-49 either way on that. I want a guy who has leadership qualities. I want someone that when my other coaches look at him, they say, yep, that's a guy I'll go into battle with and I'll go into battle for. And that's a rare commodity. Most don't have it. And you got to be pretty shrewd yourself when you're interviewing guys to know which ones do have it and don't have it. But the thing about it is, when you're sitting across from, I'm going to use one of the most overused terms in the world today, when you're sitting across from an alpha personality, you're sitting across from a guy with discernible leadership traits and characteristics, you don't have to guess. See, if you're having to guess whether they got them, they probably don't have them. Or at least not developed to the point where you need them to be the head coach at Minnesota or Auburn or South Carolina. But if they do have them, you leave that interview and you say, Janie, cross the rest of my appointments off. We got our guy. And that's how I would hire at Pate State.